Buenos dias. No hablo español, but I bring greetings from Scotland, where it is very cold. And I am very pleased to be here to talk a little about the water blueprint and the associated set of emerging policy themes that have come out of the current review of EU water law and policy. And when we look for the blueprint, we find many documents. We find the blueprint itself, the impact assessment, the staff working documents that support it. We find also the analysis of the first set of river basin management plans and the documents supporting that. And then the other information from the European Environment Agency, particularly on water quantity and quality. So there is much to read, much to think about. And I will talk a little about the blueprint, the river basin management plans, focus then on the new communication on water scarcity and drought, which is of such importance in Spain, and then finish by looking at the impact assessment and the policy initiatives that we think will follow. When we look at the blueprint, we see a number of key issues. The objective of the Water Framework Directive of good ecological status. How close are we to reaching that objective by 2015 or 2021 or 2027? And the two big pressures, issues around hydromorphology, the physical condition of our rivers, and then questions around abstraction, over-abstraction, and environmental flow. And environmental flow is something that we will hear mentioned a number of times this morning, I think. It will be a key policy objective in the coming years. Then there are issues around water efficiency, and that's a broad term, including many things. So again, we think about environmental or ecological flow. How much water do we need to leave in the system to have a healthy aquatic ecosystem? And to have an understanding of ecological flow, we need to spend more time thinking about water accounting and the water balance. How much water comes into the basin? Where does it go? Linked to water efficiency, there are a number of questions still around pricing, around full cost recovery, around the suite of economic measures that already exist and are required of states under the Water Framework Directive. And then we think about vulnerability to climate change, to flood, to drought. And throughout the documentation, we see a call for better implementation of existing EU water law and better integration across sectors and across policy areas. And we look ahead to the second round of river basin management plans. When we think about the achievements in that first round of plans, and I know that in Spain, as in some other European countries, there have been some difficulties in completing the river basin plans. We have projects in Spain, colleagues in Spain. We understand the constitutional difficulties that Spain has had in establishing the river basin districts. Most member states have submitted their plans. There is a wide variety in depth, in scale, in the size of the districts themselves that affects the final outputs. When we look at some of the key numbers from this analysis of the plans, surface water, 2009, just 43% at good ecological status. By 2015, that will go up to just 53%. So a lot of progress to be made, a lot of room for progress before 2027. When we look at groundwater, quantity and quality, to me these figures look very high. Reassuringly high, perhaps. There are a number of questions, perhaps. Some of the southern states have not completed their planning process. We don't have all that data. Perhaps that would bring the numbers on quantity down. Also, there are questions around monitoring networks, even for states that have completed. We do work in Finland, where there is much water, a large land area, very few people. The Commission has suggested they are not monitoring sufficiently. But the figures for groundwater look very good. Surface water, ecological quality, some way to go. And when we look at the key issues identified in the analysis of the river basin plans, we begin to see some themes emerging. So there are issues around law and governance, around proper implementation of the Framework Directive, around this integration of its objectives into other policy areas. There's also some discussion of reform of water rights, and again, this is a very interesting topic in Spain. We know that in the 1980s you brought groundwater from a question of private right into the public domain. And that, I think, is the kind of reform that the Commission would wish to see. We'd wish to see the management of surface water and groundwater together and as a matter of law. We'd wish to see groundwater being authorised in the public domain. But we also know the difficulties that has caused and the resistance. And we see resistance to that kind of measure across the world when any resource is moved from private to public hands. There are questions around integration of quantity and quality. And if we think here about ecological flow, it is clear and very important to note that ecological flow is not just a quality tool. It's a tool for helping to manage quantity. And we know that in the southern states of the EU, there has been criticism of the Framework Directive on the basis that it too much focused on quality, not sufficiently focused on scarcity and quantity. But of course the two are linked. So perhaps a starting point for managing quantity, if the overall objective is ecological quality, then we say how much water do we need to leave in that system, and then how best do we manage the water that's left. And then again, questions around pricing, around economics, around cost recovery. So we know that there are a suite of economic measures that can be used under the Framework Directive. Have they been used well enough? Have they been used sufficiently? And this question of pricing water, full cost recovery for water services, many member states, including the UK, have taken a narrow view, said water services is drinking water and sewerage, is urban supply, and we have full cost recovery. To my reading, Article 2 of the directive defines water services much more broadly to include agricultural water. In that case, few member states have anything like full cost recovery. And that question of the definition of water services has been submitted to the European courts for their decision. So again, we can see these common themes. Turning to scarcity and drought, we are aware, you are much better aware than me, of the prevalence of drought in recent years and the increased impacts of water scarcity that those droughts cause, and the social and economic cost of drought. And the 2003 drought, in part, led to the Commission's communication in 2007. That communication established a hierarchy for managing drought, that we first manage demand and only then look for alternative supply. Also established that we should have a strategic response to drought and scarcity. We should not be dealing with it as a one-off crisis management for each new crisis. There should be planning around drought. And the 2007 communication established some policy options, and these have then been reviewed in the most recent communication of 2012. And the first of those policy options is pricing. And again, a concern that we are not recovering the full cost for agricultural water, and that then impacts on decisions about how water is used. The second policy objective was around allocation of water, but also allocation of funding for water projects. And what we will see in the next few years is increased conditionality, where there is EU funding available, both to governments for projects being instituted by governments, but also to farmers through the Rural Development Programme. We expect to see more conditionality around water efficiency. And the sectoral efficiency of water is a key goal here. On drought risk management, we will see further encouragement for drought risk planning, but that will not be mandatory. Many states, many river basins have drought plans. How well are they integrated into the river basin plans? There's a European Drought Observatory. There's been work done on developing preliminary indicators for drought, for soil moisture, for vegetation. Again, there's a call for better integration of drought planning into the river basin plans. In terms of new and alternative supply, yes, there are options here. Desalination is one. Parts of Spain are introducing desalination, and again, bringing that water into the public domain. But we remember that the hierarchy says manage demand first. And of the available alternative supplies, the one that will see most encouragement, quite rightly so, is water reuse, which is really in a different category to other alternative supplies. And we will see standards being developed in terms of water reuse at EU level. In terms of efficiency, encouragement to have these sectoral targets, and also a recognition that water saved should, if you like, go to the basin, and rather than those who saved the water. So the farmers that we've been working with on the Hookah River Basin will tell us, well, we abstract from groundwater, we pay for our own infrastructure, we are willing to invest in better technology, but the water saved will be ours. So there will be a tension there, I think, that may be resolved by who pays for the infrastructure, but not wholly so. So water efficiency savings are not just about keeping the water for further expansion. More broadly, how do we encourage a water-saving culture? By labelling, surely. By better product design, absolutely. And also by thinking more about corporate social responsibility. And then on knowledge and data collection, there is much EU information available, many databases, many centres of knowledge. There's some emphasis in a number of these documents about better use of satellite data to help river basin authorities identify how much water there is and where it's going. And the farmers that we work with in the Hookah have been working very cooperatively with the River Basin Authority, using satellite data informally, if you like, not as a framework directive tool as such, but to support their allocation of water in that basin. Looking at the management of drought and scarcity in the river basin plans, 40% of river basin districts said it was not an issue, so for the majority it is. The Commission felt they didn't well enough distinguish between drought, a natural event, and scarcity, its impact on humans. Effects on the water environment were well identified, quality, quantity, but the economic loss is less so, and little recognition of the potential social conflicts that arise when water is scarce. And there was inadequate data on sectoral trends and availability. The Commission looked at a set of measures, 22 in total, that could be used to help manage this problem. Most of them were barely used. The top 5 measures that river basins have been using: restricting groundwater abstraction, but without enough detail as to how that would actually be achieved. Training and education, research and studies, so a lot of emphasis on soft measures. Managing distribution losses, but from the urban networks, leakage in the urban networks. And then pricing. Less than 50% of affected districts said that pricing would be a key tool in managing drought, and yet it's a mandatory tool under the Framework Directive. So a number of concerns, again, about this integration within the river basin plans. And what is the way ahead? What tools are being proposed to help manage drought? And again, first on the list, ecological flow. Until we know how much water we need in the system, it's difficult to rationally allocate the rest. Targets and pricing for sectoral efficiencies. Economic incentives. And some discussion of water trading, which again in Spain you have been instituting water trading, but with an ecological cap. So first we determine the ecological requirements, and then we trade within that. Better land use coordination, better planning, the use of green infrastructure and water reuse, and measures to improve resilience. Turning to the impact assessment, we know what the impacts are, not just of drought and scarcity, but of all our water management problems. Impact on quality, on quantity, extreme events. We know also, as is always the case, that the lower income countries suffer most, that the underdeveloped rural areas suffer most. And we know what our objectives are to make available good quality water. We know what our focus is on ecological status and managing water stress and vulnerability. What do we need to do in terms of water resource management measures? Again, water efficiency, the use of green infrastructure, alternative supplies, but emphasising reuse. And the impact assessment identified the same categories of problems that we see over and over, issues around economic instruments, integration, governance, and knowledge gaps. They consulted on a wide variety of policy options. Some are or could be regulatory. Many are not regulatory. They depend on guidance, on voluntary measures, and a number that would depend on conditionality for funding, which I think we'll hear more about later this morning. So I'm going to finish by having a look at the policy options that are likely to go forward and the way in which those options will be taken forward. And we see that while there is this suite of necessary measures around pricing, efficiency, sectoral targets, economic incentives, and indeed water accounting and ecological flow, these will not be taken forward in law, not at the moment. They will be taken forward by the means of better guidance, much of it through the CIS site. But we would also note that insofar as there are outstanding obligations under the Framework Directive around cost recovery for water services, those of course are mandatory and the Commission will continue to enforce them. In terms of managing abstractions, again there's a suggestion that satellite data will be helpful here. In terms of water efficiency for products and for buildings, well, the intention seems to be for a voluntary scheme for water efficiency ratings for buildings. For appliances and products, there will be continued voluntary schemes, but also some mandatory labelling around water efficiency, and some new emphasis on product design through the eco-design work packages. For water reuse, there will be new EU standards. So there is a concern that it is difficult to have a free market where different states have different standards for reused water. So European level standards, I think, will be very helpful to try and encourage reuse of water. And there will also be a review of state reporting requirements in relation to water. We understand many states have told us, have told the Commission as well, I'm sure, that the reporting requirements are quite onerous, quite complex, so that will be looked at again. And in terms of funding mechanisms, perhaps not much more in cross-compliance, although there are still one or two suggestions that the Commission would like to see as a question of cross-compliance, but much more conditionality of funding. So I will conclude there with a few thoughts, and I'd be very happy to take any questions or comments. It's clear from looking across this documentation and across this policy space that the big issues around pricing, cost recovery, water efficiency, integration of quantity and quality with ecological flow as a major tool for that, integration across sectors and policy areas, but also, of course, the continued scrutiny and enforcement of existing legal requirements under the Framework Directive and the suite of European water law that remains in force with that. Thank you.